The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldoria's royal palace. Captain Marcus Thorne stood at his post near the grand entrance, his weathered hands gripping the ceremonial spear that had been passed down through generations of palace guards. At 52 years old, Marcus had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royal family. His steel-gray hair was neatly trimmed beneath his ceremonial helmet, and his dark eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the beauty and darkness that could exist within palace walls. Marcus had started as a young recruit 34 years ago, fresh from the countryside with nothing but determination and a strong sense of duty. He had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect from both his fellow guards and the royal family themselves. King Edmund trusted him implicitly, and Queen Isabella often sought his counsel on matters of palace security. But it was Prince Louis, the king's youngest son, who held a special place in Marcus's heart. Prince Louis was 17 years old, with bright blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity and golden hair that caught the sunlight whenever he walked through the palace corridors. Unlike his older brother Prince Alexander, who was being groomed to inherit the throne and often seemed burdened by the weight of his future responsibilities, Louis possessed a gentle spirit and genuine kindness that endeared him to everyone he met. He would often stop to chat with the servants, remember their children's names, and bring small gifts to the guards during their long shifts. Marcus remembered the day Louis was born. He had been on duty that night, standing guard outside the queen's chambers as the royal physicians attended to the birth. When the cries of a newborn baby finally echoed through the halls, Marcus had felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this new life that would be placed under his care. Over the years, he had watched Louis grow from a curious toddler who would toddle up to the guards and tug on their uniforms, to a thoughtful teenager who genuinely cared about the people around him. The palace itself was a marvel of architecture, with soaring ceilings, intricate tapestries, and paintings that told the history of the kingdom. But, for all its beauty, it could also be a lonely place, especially for someone like Louis who possessed such a warm and open heart. The rigid protocols and constant scrutiny that came with royal life often left him feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by people at all times. On this particular morning, Marcus noticed an unusual tension in the air. King Edmund had been in closed-door meetings with his advisors for 3 consecutive days, and rumors were circulating among the staff about potential threats to the kingdom's stability. There were whispers of neighboring kingdoms forming alliances that could pose a threat to Eldoria's sovereignty, and some spoke of internal political pressures that were causing strain within the royal court. Prince Alexander, who was 23 years old and would inherit the throne, had been noticeably absent from the palace for several weeks. He had been sent on a diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces, but his extended absence was causing concern among the court officials. Some wondered if there were complications with the mission, while others speculated about potential romantic entanglements that might be keeping him away from his duties. Marcus had also noticed changes in the behavior of some of the newer court officials. Lord Reginald Blackwood, who had recently been appointed as the king's chief advisor, seemed to have gained considerable influence over the king's decisions. Blackwood was a man in his early 50s with sharp features and calculating eyes that never seemed to miss anything. He had arrived at court 6 months ago with impressive credentials and recommendations from other noble houses, but something about him made Marcus uneasy. The captain had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and his instinct for telling him that Blackwood was not entirely what he seemed. The man was always impeccably dressed, spoke with eloquence and apparent wisdom, and seemed to have an answer for every question. But Marcus had observed him in unguarded moments, when he thought no one was watching, and had seen glimpses of something cold and calculating beneath the polished exterior. There had been subtle changes in the palace routine since Blackwood's arrival. Certain meetings were now held behind closed doors with only select individuals present. Some long-serving court officials had been reassigned to lesser positions, and new faces had appeared in positions of influence. The changes were gradual and seemingly reasonable on the surface, but when taken together, they painted a picture that concerned Marcus deeply. Prince Louis had also seemed more withdrawn lately. The cheerful greetings and spontaneous conversations that Marcus had grown accustomed to had become less frequent. When they did interact, Louis seemed distracted and occasionally glanced around nervously, as if he were afraid of being overheard. Marcus had wanted to ask the prince about this change in behavior, but protocol dictated that guards should not initiate personal conversations with members of the royal family unless specifically invited to do so. The palace's daily routine continued as it had for centuries. The morning bells chimed at dawn, signaling the beginning of another day of court activities. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying messages, preparing meals, and maintaining the spotless condition of the royal residence. Guards took their positions at strategic points throughout the building, their presence both protective and ceremonial. Marcus's position near the main entrance gave him a unique vantage point to observe the comings and goings of everyone who entered or left the palace. He knew the daily patterns of the royal family, the regular visitors, and the various officials who conducted business within these walls. Any deviation from normal patterns caught his attention immediately, and today there seemed to be more unusual activity than normal. Several messengers had arrived before dawn, which was unusual for typical court business. Lord Blackwood had been seen entering the king's private study very early in the morning, and there had been hushed conversations between various court officials throughout the day. The atmosphere felt charged with tension, though Marcus couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus noticed that Prince Louis had not appeared for his usual walk through the gardens. The prince typically spent time outdoors every day, often reading under his favorite oak tree or practicing his swordsmanship with the master-at-arms. His absence was concerning, especially given the subtle changes in his behavior over recent weeks. The captain made a mental note to check with other guards about Louis's whereabouts, though he had to be careful not to appear overly concerned. Palace guards were expected to be observant and protective, but they were also expected to maintain proper boundaries and not interfere in royal family matters unless specifically requested to do so. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows through the palace windows when Marcus heard raised voices coming from the direction of the king's private chambers. The voices were too distant and muffled for him to make out specific words, but the tones suggested disagreement or conflict. This was unusual, as King Edmund was typically a calm and measured man who rarely raised his voice, even in private discussions. Marcus remained at his post, but his senses were heightened as he listened for any signs of trouble. The palace had its share of political disagreements and family tensions, but open conflict was rare and always cause for concern among the security staff. His hand instinctively moved closer to his sword, though he hoped such preparation would prove unnecessary. The evening meal was typically served in the great dining hall, where the royal family would gather with their closest advisors and guests. Tonight, however, word spread among the staff that the king would be dining privately in his chambers with only Lord Blackwood present. Prince Louis was also notably absent from the evening's activities, which was highly unusual for him. As darkness began to fall over the palace, Marcus found himself growing increasingly concerned about the day's unusual events. The combination of secretive meetings, absent family members, and the general atmosphere of tension was creating a perfect storm of unease among the palace staff. Many of the long-serving employees were whispering among themselves, sharing concerns about the changes they had observed. The night shift of guards began to take their positions as the evening wore on. Marcus normally would have been relieved of his duties by now, but something compelled him to remain at his post longer than usual. His instincts were telling him that something significant was building, and he wanted to be available if his services were needed. It was during these quiet evening hours that Marcus first noticed unusual activity near the palace's side entrances. Several figures in dark cloaks had approached the building and were admitted through a servant's entrance by someone Marcus couldn't identify from his position. This was highly irregular, as all evening visitors were supposed to be announced and escorted through the main entrance where their identities could be verified and recorded. The captain made a quick decision to investigate this unusual activity. He signaled to the guard who was preparing to relieve him, indicating that he would be making a brief patrol of the perimeter before ending his shift. This was within his authority as captain, though he knew he would need to be careful not to interfere with any legitimate palace business. As Marcus made his way around the building, staying in the shadows to avoid detection, he observed more signs of unusual activity. Additional cloaked figures were positioned at various points around the palace grounds, and they appeared to be maintaining some kind of coordinated watch. Their positioning was strategic, covering all the major exits and approaches to the building. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The palace was being surrounded by unknown individuals, and this was happening with apparent coordination and planning. This was not a spontaneous event or a random security threat. Someone had organized this operation, and given the timing and the presence of figures already inside the palace, it was likely that someone within the court was involved. Marcus's mind raced as he considered his options. He could sound the alarm and mobilize the palace guard, but if this operation had inside support, such an action might trigger violence before he could properly assess the situation. He could try to reach the king directly, but the normal routes to the royal chambers might already be compromised. His first priority had to be gathering more information about the scope and nature of this threat. Moving carefully through the shadows, Marcus worked his way back toward the main palace building. He needed to check on the security of the royal family and determine whether they were aware of the danger that seemed to be closing in around them. The weight of his responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he realized that the safety of the people he had sworn to protect might depend on the decisions he made in the next few minutes. The palace, which had been his home and workplace for over 3 decades, suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound could signal danger, and every person he encountered might be friend or foe. Marcus had trained for situations like this throughout his career, but the reality of facing such a crisis was more challenging than any training exercise could have prepared him for. As he approached the main entrance where he had stood guard just hours before, Marcus saw that his worst fears were beginning to be realized. The normal guards had been replaced by unfamiliar faces, and these new guards were positioning themselves in ways that suggested they were preparing to control access to and from the building rather than simply protecting it. The captain realized that whatever was happening was already well underway, and time was running out for him to mount any effective response. His thoughts turned immediately to Prince Louis, whose gentle nature and trusting personality would make him particularly vulnerable in a situation like this. Marcus had to find a way to ensure the safety of the royal family, especially the young prince who had unknowingly captured his protective instincts so completely over the years. The stage was set for a night that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about the palace, the royal family, and his own role in protecting them. As he prepared to take action, he couldn't have imagined the emotional confrontation that lay ahead or the heartbreaking revelation that would shatter his understanding of the very people he had devoted his life to serving. Marcus moved through the palace corridors with practiced stealth, his decades of experience serving him well as he navigated the familiar passages that had become treacherous territory. The ornate hallways that had once represented security and order now felt like a maze filled with potential threats. Every tapestry could conceal an enemy. Every alcove might hide someone waiting in ambush. The captain's first priority was reaching the royal chambers to assess the safety of the king and Prince Louis. As he moved deeper into the palace, he began to notice subtle signs that confirmed his worst fears. Doors that should have been guarded stood unattended, while other passages were blocked by unfamiliar guards who were clearly not part of the regular palace security force. The infiltration was more comprehensive than Marcus had initially realized. This was not a simple external attack that could be repelled by mobilizing the loyal guards. This was a carefully orchestrated takeover that had been planned and executed with inside knowledge of the palace's security protocols and daily routines. Someone with intimate access to the royal household had betrayed everything Marcus had spent his life protecting. As he approached the wing of the palace that housed the royal family's private chambers, Marcus encountered his first direct obstacle. 2 guards he didn't recognize were stationed at a checkpoint that had never existed before. They wore uniforms similar to the regular palace guard, but Marcus's trained eye caught subtle differences in the fabric and insignia that marked them as imposters. The captain had to make a quick decision. He could try to bluff his way past these guards using his authority as captain, but if they had been briefed about him specifically, such an approach would likely result in immediate confrontation. Alternatively, he could find another route, but time was becoming increasingly precious as the unknown threat continued to tighten its grip on the palace. Marcus chose a third option. He retreated to a service corridor that connected to the royal wing through a route known only to the most senior palace staff. This passage had been designed centuries ago as an emergency escape route for the royal family, and its existence was one of the closely guarded secrets that came with Marcus's position as captain of the guard. The service corridor was narrow and dimly lit, with walls that had been carved from the same stone as the palace's foundation. As Marcus made his way through this hidden passage, he thought about all the times he had walked these same halls in happier circumstances. He remembered escorting young Prince Louis on secret adventures to the palace kitchens, where the boy would charm Marcus the cooks into giving him extra sweets before important state dinners. Those memories seemed to belong to a different lifetime now, as Marcus faced the possibility that the innocent world Prince Louis had grown up and was about to be destroyed forever. The captain's protective instincts toward the young prince had grown stronger over the years, partly because of Louis's genuine kindness, and partly because Marcus had never had children of his own. In many ways, watching Louis grow up had been one of the greatest joys of his long service to the crown. The hidden passage eventually led to a concealed entrance behind a bookshelf in the royal library. Marcus carefully opened the secret door and listened for any signs of activity in the library before entering. The room was dark and apparently empty, but he could hear voices coming from the direction of the king's private study, which was located just beyond the library. Moving carefully between the towering bookshelves, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the entrance to the king's study without being seen. What he witnessed through the partially open door made his blood run cold. King Edmund was seated at his desk, but he was clearly not in control of the situation. Lord Blackwood stood behind the king's chair, and several armed men in dark clothing were positioned around the room. The scene was surreal and horrifying. Marcus had served King Edmund for over 3 decades, and he had never seen the monarch look so defeated and powerless. The king's normally proud bearing was gone, replaced by the slumped posture of a man who had been cornered and outmaneuvered. Lord Blackwood was speaking in low tones, but his words carried the unmistakable tone of someone issuing ultimatums rather than offering counsel. Marcus strained to hear the conversation, catching fragments that painted a terrifying picture of the night's events. Blackwood was apparently demanding that the king sign documents that would transfer significant power to a council led by Blackwood himself. The armed men were not merely guards. They were there to ensure the king's compliance through the implicit threat of violence. The captain realized that he was witnessing a carefully planned coup that had been months in the making. Blackwood's gradual accumulation of influence, the strategic placement of his supporters in key positions, and the timing of Prince Alexander's absence from the palace. All of these elements had been orchestrated to create this moment when the royal family would be most vulnerable. As Marcus listened, his heart sank further when he heard Blackwood mention Prince Louis. The Lord was explaining to the king that the young prince was being held in a secure location within the palace, and that his safety depended entirely on the king's cooperation with the new arrangements. The implication was clear. Any resistance from the king would result in harm coming to his youngest son. The captain had to fight every instinct that told him to burst into the room and defend his king. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and such an action would likely result in immediate violence that could endanger both the king and Prince Louis. Marcus needed to find a way to help them both, but that would require careful planning and probably some assistance from loyal guards who hadn't yet been identified and neutralized by Blackwood's forces. Marcus carefully retreated from his observation position and began to consider his options. The palace's communication systems had likely been compromised, so he couldn't simply send word to loyal guards stationed in other parts of the building. He needed to physically locate trustworthy allies and coordinate a response that could counter Blackwood's advantages in numbers and positioning. The captain's knowledge of the palace's hidden passages and secret rooms gave him a significant advantage in moving undetected. He began to make his way toward the guards' quarters, hoping to find members of his security force who were still loyal to the crown and unaware of the coup taking place around them. As he moved through the service corridors, Marcus encountered evidence of just how thoroughly Blackwood had planned this takeover. Key communication points had been disabled, weapons storage areas had been secured by unfamiliar guards, and several of the palace's most experienced and loyal security personnel were nowhere to be found. They had either been neutralized in some way, or they were being held prisoner to prevent them from interfering with Blackwood's plans. The captain reached the guards' quarters to find them largely empty, which was unusual for this time of night. Normally, off-duty guards would be present, playing cards, sharing meals, or simply resting between shifts. The absence of these men suggested that they had either been reassigned to other duties or removed from the palace entirely as part of Blackwood's security measures. Marcus did find 2 younger guards in the quarters, men who had joined the palace security force within the past year. They were confused and concerned about the unusual orders they had received that evening, which had separated them from their normal duties and left them uncertain about their role in the night's activities. Their confusion confirmed that even Blackwood's planning hadn't been perfect. Some loyal guards had simply been overlooked rather than deliberately neutralized. The captain quickly briefed these guards on what he had observed, watching their faces change from confusion to shock to grim determination as they realized the scope of the crisis. Both men were young, but well-trained, and their loyalty to the crown was unquestionable. However, Marcus knew that 3 men, even with his experience and their enthusiasm, would not be enough to directly confront the forces that had taken control of the palace. Instead, Marcus decided to focus on intelligence gathering and rescue operations. If Prince Louis was being held somewhere in the palace, then locating him and ensuring his safety had to be the top priority. The captain's knowledge of the building's layout and hidden passages gave him the best chance of finding the prince before Blackwood could use him as leverage against the king. The search for Prince Louis led Marcus back into the maze of corridors and chambers that made up the palace's vast interior. He checked the prince's normal quarters first, finding them empty but showing signs of a struggle. Furniture had been overturned, and personal items were scattered across the floor, suggesting that Louis had either resisted his captors or tried to escape before being subdued. This evidence of struggle filled Marcus with both pride and fear. He was proud that Prince Louis had shown courage in the face of danger, but he was terrified about what might have happened to the young man after he was overpowered by his attackers. The captain's protective instincts went into overdrive as he imagined the fear and confusion that Louis must have experienced. Marcus continued his search, checking various rooms and chambers where a prisoner might be held. The palace had several areas that could serve as temporary holding cells, including storage rooms, unused servant quarters, and even some of the older sections of the building that were rarely visited by the current staff. It was in one of these older sections that Marcus finally found what he was looking for. He heard voices coming from behind a heavy wooden door that led to a room that had once been used as a wine cellar, but had been abandoned for years. The voices were muffled, but Marcus could make out at least 3 different speakers, and one of them sounded young and distressed. The captain positioned himself where he could observe the room without being detected. Through a crack in the door, he could see Prince Louis sitting in a chair in the center of the room. The young prince's hands were bound, and there were obvious signs that he had been roughed up during his capture. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his clothes were torn, and there was a bruise forming on his left cheek. 3 guards were watching over Louis, and their demeanor suggested they were becoming increasingly frustrated with their captive. The prince was apparently not being as cooperative as they had expected, and Marcus could hear fragments of conversation that suggested Louis was demanding to see his father and asking questions about what was happening in the palace. The sight of Prince Louis in distress triggered every protective instinct Marcus had developed over 34 years of service. This young man, who had grown up under Marcus's watchful eye, was being treated like a common criminal by men who had no right to even be in the palace, let alone lay hands on a member of the royal family. Marcus began to formulate a plan to rescue Prince Louis, but he knew he would need to be extremely careful. The room had only one entrance, and the 3 guards were all armed and alert. Any direct assault would put Louis at risk, and Marcus couldn't bear the thought of the prince being harmed during a rescue attempt that went wrong. The captain decided to wait and observe, hoping for an opportunity when the guards might become less vigilant or when some of them might leave the room temporarily. As he watched and listened, he learned more about the scope of Blackwood's operation and the timeline for his coup. The guards were discussing plans for the morning, when Blackwood apparently intended to make a public announcement about changes in the kingdom's leadership. They spoke about bringing Prince Louis to witness his father's cooperation with these changes, using the young man's presence to demonstrate the legitimacy of the new regime. Marcus realized that time was running short. Once morning came and Blackwood made his power grab public, it would become much more difficult to reverse the situation or rescue the royal family. The captain had to act soon, but he also had to act wisely to avoid making the situation worse. As he continued to observe and plan, Marcus noticed that one of the guards seemed less committed to his duties than the others. This guard kept checking a pocket watch and glancing toward the door as if he was expecting to be relieved or had somewhere else he needed to be. This potential weakness in their security might provide the opportunity Marcus needed to begin his rescue operation. The captain began to formulate a more detailed plan that would exploit this guard's apparent distraction and the layout of the room to create confusion and allow him to free Prince Louis. But he also knew that rescuing the prince was only the first step in a much larger challenge. Even if he could get Louis to safety, they would still need to find a way to help the king and ultimately restore legitimate authority to the palace. As Marcus prepared to put his rescue plan into action, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were just the beginning of a much larger crisis. Blackwood's coup was too well-organized and comprehensive to be simply about seizing power in Eldoria. There had to be larger political forces at work, possibly involving the neighboring kingdoms that had been forming alliances in recent months. The captain realized that his actions in the next few hours might not only determine the fate of the royal family, but also the future of the entire kingdom. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but Marcus had dedicated his life to protecting the crown, and he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead to fulfill that sacred duty. Marcus waited in the shadows for nearly an hour, studying the guard's patterns and looking for the right moment to strike. The distracted guard he had noticed earlier continued to show signs of impatience and inattention, frequently leaving his post to peer out into the corridor or check his pocket watch. The other two guards seemed more focused, but they had fallen into a comfortable routine that suggested they weren't expecting any immediate threats. During this observation period, Marcus also paid careful attention to Prince Louis's condition and demeanor. Despite his obvious distress and the rough treatment he had received, the young prince maintained a dignity that made Marcus proud. Louis wasn't cowering or begging his captors for mercy. Instead, he sat upright in his chair, meeting their gazes directly and responding to their questions with polite but firm refusal to cooperate. The captain could see that Louis's brave behavior was beginning to irritate his guards. They had clearly expected him to be more frightened and compliant, and his continued resistance was frustrating their attempts to use him as a simple pawn in Blackwood's larger game. This growing frustration might work to Marcus's advantage, as angry guards were more likely to make mistakes than calm, professional ones. When the distracted guard finally stepped outside the room to check the corridor again, Marcus saw his opportunity. The captain moved quickly but silently, positioning himself beside the door where he could act as soon as the guard returned. His plan was to neutralize this guard quietly and then use the element of surprise to deal with the remaining two before they could harm Prince Louis or raise an alarm. The guard returned to the room, just as Marcus had anticipated, and the captain struck with precision born from decades of combat training. A swift blow to the base of the skull rendered the guard unconscious before he could make a sound, and Marcus caught the falling body to prevent any noise that might alert the others inside. Marcus gently lowered the unconscious guard to the floor and quickly relieved him of his weapons and keys. Armed with a sword and dagger, the captain prepared for the more dangerous phase of his rescue operation. The remaining two guards would not be as easy to surprise, and there was always the risk that Louis might be hurt in the ensuing conflict. The captain took a deep breath and burst through the door, relying on speed and aggression to overcome the numerical disadvantage. The two remaining guards were caught completely off guard by the sudden assault. Marcus's first target was the guard standing closest to Prince Louis, as eliminating this threat would reduce the immediate danger to the prince. The clash was brief but intense. Marcus's experience and training gave him a significant advantage over guards who were clearly more comfortable with intimidation than actual combat. Within moments, both guards had been neutralized, one knocked unconscious, and the other disarmed and subdued. Prince Louis had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes, and when it was over, he looked at Marcus with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and residual fear. The captain quickly moved to free the prince from his bonds, his hands working efficiently while his eyes continued to scan for potential threats. "Captain Marcus," Louis whispered, his voice hoarse from strain and emotion. "I knew you would come. I knew someone loyal would find me." "Your Highness," Marcus replied softly as he cut through the ropes, binding Louis's hands. "Are you injured? Can you walk?" "I'm bruised, but I can manage," Louis assured him, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had chafed. "Captain, they have my father. Lord Blackwood is forcing him to sign documents. We have to help him." Marcus helped the prince to his feet, noting the determination in Lewis's voice despite everything he had endured. "We will help your father, your highness, but first we need to get you to safety. This palace is no longer secure." "I won't abandon my father," Lewis said firmly, displaying the same courage that had impressed Marcus during the confrontation with the guards. "If you know a way to help him, I'm coming with you." The captain understood the prince's desire to help his father, but he also knew that Lewis's safety had to be the priority. However, he also recognized that the young man had inherited his father's stubborn streak and would not be easily persuaded to seek safety while his family was in danger. "Very well, your highness," Marcus said after a moment's consideration, "but you must promise to follow my instructions exactly. The palace is full of Blackwood's men, and one mistake could get us both killed." Lewis nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Marcus quickly checked the unconscious guards to ensure they would remain incapacitated, then led the prince out of the makeshift prison and back into the maze of corridors that honeycombed the palace. As they moved through the building, Marcus explained what he had observed and learned about the scope of Blackwood's coup. Lewis listened with growing horror as he realized how thoroughly their trusted advisor had betrayed the royal family and manipulated events to create this crisis. "How long has this been planned?" Lewis asked as they paused in a hidden alcove to avoid a patrol of unfamiliar guards. "Months, possibly longer," Marcus replied. "Blackwood has been positioning his people throughout the palace and removing anyone who might oppose him. Your brother's extended absence was probably part of the plan. They needed him away from the palace when they made their move." "Alexander," Lewis whispered, sudden fear in his voice. "Is he safe? Do we know where he is?" Marcus had been wondering the same thing. Prince Alexander's diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces had been extended several times, and now it seemed likely that these extensions had been orchestrated to keep him away from the palace during the coup. Whether Alexander was safe, captured, or worse remained an unknown that added another layer of concern to an already complex situation. "We don't know," Marcus admitted, "but right now, our focus has to be on helping your father and regaining control of the palace. Once we do that, we can send word to your brother and bring him home safely." They continued their careful journey through the palace, with Marcus using his knowledge of hidden passages and service corridors to avoid the main routes that were likely being watched by Blackwood's forces. Lewis proved to be an excellent companion in this dangerous game of hide and seek, moving quietly and following Marcus's instructions precisely. As they approached the area near the king's study, Marcus began to formulate a plan for helping King Edmund. The direct approach that had worked for rescuing Lewis would not be sufficient when dealing with a room full of armed men holding the king hostage. They would need a more sophisticated strategy that could neutralize the threat without putting the king at risk. "Your Highness," Marcus said as they took shelter in the same hidden passage he had used earlier for reconnaissance, "I need you to stay here while I assess the current situation with your father. The circumstances may have changed since I was here before." "I understand," Lewis replied, though Marcus could see the struggle in the young man's eyes between his desire to help and his recognition that he might be more liability than asset in a direct confrontation. Marcus made his way back to the observation point behind the bookshelf in the royal library. The scene in the king's study had evolved since his earlier reconnaissance, and not in a favorable direction. Additional armed men had joined the original group, and King Edmund appeared even more defeated than before. Papers were scattered across the desk, suggesting that some of the demanded documents had already been signed. Lord Blackwood was speaking more forcefully now, his earlier pretense of respectful counsel completely abandoned. He was issuing direct orders to the king, backed up by the obvious threat of violence for his armed supporters. Marcus could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and that time was running out to mount any effective rescue operation. The captain retreated from his observation point and returned to Prince Louis with growing concern. The odds against them were becoming overwhelming, and he began to consider whether their best option might be to escape the palace entirely and seek help from loyal forces outside the building. "What did you see?" Louis asked anxiously as Marcus rejoined him in the hidden passage. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to crush the prince's hopes, but also needing to be honest about their dire circumstances. "The situation has worsened," he admitted. "There are more guards now, and your father appears to be under increasing pressure to comply with Blackwood's demands." Louis absorbed this information with visible distress, but he also showed the mental toughness that Marcus had always admired in him. "What are our options?" the prince asked, his voice steady despite the emotional strain he was under. "We could try to reach the king directly," Marcus said, "but the risks are enormous. Or we could try to escape the palace and seek help from loyal troops stationed outside the city." "How long would that take?" Lewis asked. "Several hours at minimum," Marcus replied. "And there's no guarantee that Blackwood hasn't already made arrangements to prevent outside forces from intervening." Lewis was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing their limited options. When he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that reminded Marcus powerfully of King Edmund in his younger years. "We can't abandon my father," Lewis said firmly. "If we run away and something happens to him, I'll never forgive myself. There has to be a way to help him." Marcus admired the prince's loyalty and courage, but he also feared that such nobility might lead to tragedy for both father and son. Still, he had spent his entire adult life in service to this royal family, and if Prince Louis was determined to risk everything to save his father, then Marcus would do everything in his power to make such a rescue possible. "Very well," the captain said, "but we'll need a plan that gives us some chance of success. A direct assault won't work. We're too outnumbered." As they discussed possible strategies, Marcus remembered something that might give them a crucial advantage. The king's study had a secret entrance that connected to the royal family's private chambers, a passage that had been built centuries ago as an escape route during times of siege. If they could reach that passage undetected, they might be able to enter the study from an unexpected direction and catch Blackwood's forces off guard. "There's a hidden entrance to your father's study," Marcus explained. "It's accessed through your parents' private chambers. If we can reach that area without being detected, we might be able to surprise them." Lewis's eyes lit up with hope. "I know that passage," he said. "Father showed it to me years ago when I was curious about the palace's secret doors. Can we get there?" Marcus considered the route they would need to take. It would require crossing several areas that were likely under observation by Blackwood's guards, but the alternative was accepting defeat and abandoning King Edmund to whatever fate Blackwood had planned for him. "It won't be easy," Marcus warned, "and if we're caught, we won't get another chance." "Then we won't get caught," Lewis said with conviction that made Marcus proud of the young man he had helped to protect and guide over the years. They began their most dangerous journey yet through the palace, moving toward the royal family's private chambers while avoiding the increasing number of guards that Blackwood had stationed throughout the building. Marcus led the way, using every bit of his knowledge and experience to find routes that would keep them hidden from their enemies. The tension was almost unbearable as they moved through corridors and passages that had once been safe and familiar, but now felt like hostile territory. Every sound might signal discovery, every shadow might conceal a threat, and every step brought them closer to either salvation or disaster. As they approached the royal chambers, Marcus realized that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The secret passage to the king's study would allow them to surprise Blackwood's forces, but it would also require them to engage in direct combat with professional soldiers while protecting both the king and themselves. The odds were still heavily against them, but Marcus was determined to give Prince Louis and King Edmund the best chance possible to survive this night of betrayal and violence. The royal chambers were eerily quiet as Marcus and Prince Louis approached the area that had once been the most secure and private part of the palace. The ornate doors that led to the king and queen's personal quarters stood slightly ajar, which was unusual and concerning. Marcus signaled for Louis to wait while he investigated the situation more thoroughly. Peering through the gap in the doors, Marcus could see that the royal chambers had been searched but appeared to be currently unoccupied. Furniture had been moved, drawers had been opened, and papers were scattered about, clear evidence that Blackwood's people had been looking for something specific. The captain wondered what they might have been seeking and whether they had found it. "It's clear for now," Marcus whispered to Louis as he motioned the prince forward, "but we need to move quickly. They might return at any moment." Louis entered his parents' private chambers with visible emotion. This space held countless memories of family gatherings, private conversations, and quiet moments that had shaped his childhood. Seeing it violated and ransacked by strangers was deeply painful, and Marcus could see the anger building in the young prince's eyes. "Focus on our mission," Marcus reminded him gently. "We can deal with the emotional aspects later. Right now, Your father needs our help." Lewis nodded and led Marcus toward the concealed entrance to the secret passage. The hidden door was located behind an ornate tapestry that depicted the founding of their kingdoms centuries ago. Lewis pressed a specific sequence of decorative elements on the wall, and a section of stone swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow passage that led directly to the king's study. The passage was cramped and dark, forcing them to move in single file, with Marcus leading the way. The walls were rough stone that had been carved from the living rock beneath the palace, and the air was stale and musty from centuries of limited use. As they moved through this hidden route, Marcus could feel the weight of history around them. This passage had been used by kings and queens in times of crisis throughout the kingdom's long history. The passage ended at another concealed door that opened behind a large bookcase in the king's study. Marcus could hear voices on the other side of the hidden entrance, and he held up a hand to signal Lewis to stop while he listened and assessed the situation they were about to enter. Lord Blackwood was speaking in angry tones, apparently frustrated by some aspect of King Edmund's continued resistance. The sound of papers being shuffled suggested that negotiations or demand were still ongoing, but the increasingly hostile tone indicated that Blackwood's patience was wearing thin. "Sign the remaining documents," Blackwood demanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who was no longer bothering with pretense. "Your cooperation thus far has been noted, but we need your signature on the treaty amendments and the succession modifications." "I will not sign away my kingdom's sovereignty," King Edmund replied, his voice weak but still defiant. "And I will not alter the succession laws to benefit your political ambitions." Marcus felt a surge of pride hearing his king's continued resistance, but he also recognized the dangerous escalation in the confrontation. Blackwood was clearly prepared to use force to get what he wanted, and King Edmund's refusal was pushing the situation toward violence. "Your Majesty," Blackwood said with mock courtesy, "perhaps you need additional motivation to see reason. Bring in the prince." Marcus's blood ran cold as he heard footsteps moving toward the door of the study. They were planning to use Prince Louis as leverage against his father, and they believed they still had the young man as their prisoner. This development gave Marcus and Louis a crucial advantage. Blackwood would be expecting a captive prince, not a freed one accompanied by the captain of the guard. Marcus quickly whispered instructions to Louis about what would happen when they burst through the hidden entrance. The prince would need to move immediately to his father's side while Marcus dealt with the armed guards. It was a dangerous plan that required precise timing and more than a little luck, but it was their best chance to save King Edmund. The sound of the study door opening was followed by confused voices as Blackwood's men discovered that their prisoner was no longer where they had left him. Marcus could hear rapid discussions and the sound of running feet as guards were dispatched to search for the missing prince. "Where's Prince Louis?" Blackwood demanded, his voice sharp with sudden concern. "I have no idea," King Edmund replied, and Marcus could hear the hope creeping into the monarch's voice as he realized his son had somehow escaped his captors. This confusion and distraction provided the perfect opportunity for Marcus and Louis to act. The captain pushed open the hidden door behind the bookcase, and both men emerged into the study with weapons drawn. The scene that greeted them was even worse than Marcus had feared. King Edmund was bound to his chair, and several guards had their swords pointed at him while Blackwood stood over the desk with documents scattered before him. "Father," Louis called out as he rushed toward the king's chair, while Marcus engaged the nearest guards before they could react to the surprise attack. The captain's years of combat experience served him well as he fought multiple opponents in the confined space of the study. His goal was not necessarily to defeat all of Blackwood's men, but to create enough chaos and confusion to allow Louis to free his father and for all three of them to escape through the secret passage. Lord Blackwood reacted to the sudden turn of events with a mixture of rage and calculation. "Kill them all," he shouted to his guards, while simultaneously grabbing a dagger from the desk and moving toward King Edmund with clear intent to use the monarch as a human shield. Marcus found himself fighting desperately against overwhelming odds while trying to prevent Blackwood from harming the king. Louis had reached his father and was working frantically to cut through the ropes that bound him, but the process was taking precious time that they didn't have. The clash of swords filled the study as Marcus parried and struck with precision born from decades of training. He managed to disable two of the guards, but more were entering the room as the sounds of combat drew attention from elsewhere in the palace. The captain realized that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "Your Highness," Marcus called to Lewis. "We need to leave now." "Almost there," Lewis replied, his hands working frantically with the ropes while his eyes kept darting toward the combat taking place around them. King Edmund was finally freed from his bonds, but he was weakened from hours of captivity and the stress of the night's events. Lewis helped his father to his feet while Marcus continued to hold off Blackwood's forces, but the captain knew he couldn't maintain this defense much longer. It was at this critical moment that Lord Blackwood made a desperate gamble. Unable to use King Edmund as leverage and facing the collapse of his carefully planned coup, he lunged toward Prince Louis with the dagger he had taken from the desk. His intent was clearly to take the young prince hostage and use him to force the others to surrender. Marcus saw the attack developing and tried to intercede, but he was engaged with 2 guards and couldn't reach Blackwood in time. King Edmund, despite his weakened condition, threw himself between his son and the attacking lord, taking the blade intended for Louis. The king's sacrifice created a moment of shocked silence in the room as everyone processed what had just happened. King Edmund collapsed to the floor with blood spreading across his shirt, while Louis knelt beside him in horrified disbelief. "Father!" Louis cried out, his voice breaking with anguish as he tried to staunch the bleeding from his father's wound. The sight of his king falling galvanized Marcus into action beyond anything he had experienced before. With a roar of rage and grief, he broke through the guards who had been holding him back and reached Lord Blackwood before the man could retreat or strike again. The confrontation between Marcus and Blackwood was brief but decisive. Decades of loyal service and protective instinct fueled the captain's strength as he overpowered the lord who had betrayed everything Marcus held sacred. Within moments, Blackwood was disarmed and unconscious on the floor of the study. The remaining guards, seeing their leader defeated and faced with Marcus's fury, began to retreat toward the door. Some fled entirely, while others hesitated as if uncertain whether their loyalty to Blackwood extended to fighting to the death for his failed cause. Marcus quickly moved to King Edmund's side, where Louis was desperately trying to help his father. The king's wound was serious, but not immediately fatal, giving them hope that he might survive if they could get him proper medical attention quickly. "We need to get him to the royal physician," Marcus said urgently, while keeping one eye on the door for signs of reinforcements. "Can you carry it?" Louis asked, his voice tight with worry and fear. Marcus nodded and carefully lifted King Edmund in his arms. The king was conscious but weak, and Marcus could see the pain in his eyes as well as the concern for his son's safety that still dominated his thoughts even in his injured condition. "Louis," King Edmund whispered weakly, "are you hurt? Did they harm you?" "I'm fine, father," Louis assured him, though his voice trembled with emotion. "Captain Marcus rescued me. He saved us both." King Edmund looked at Marcus with gratitude that spoke of decades of trust and respect between them. "Thank you," the king managed to say. "I knew you would not abandon us." "Never, your majesty," Marcus replied firmly. "Now let's get you somewhere safe so we can tend to your wound properly." They made their way back to the secret passage, with Louis leading the way and Marcus carrying the wounded king. Behind them, the study was in chaos as the remaining guards tried to figure out what to do with their unconscious leader and their collapsed conspiracy. The journey through the narrow passage was challenging with King Edmund's additional weight and his injury, but Marcus's determination carried them through. Louis stayed close, offering support and encouragement while keeping watch for any signs that they were being followed. When they emerged from the passage into the royal chambers, Marcus quickly assessed their options for getting medical help for the king. The palace's regular physician might be compromised or prevented from reaching them, but Marcus knew of other alternatives that might be available. "Your Highness," Marcus said to Louis, "I need you to stay with your father while I secure this area and summon help." "Can you do that?" Louis nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of his responsibility. "I won't leave him," he promised. Marcus quickly moved through the royal chambers, securing the entrances and establishing defensive positions that would allow them to hold this area if Blackwood's remaining forces attempted to recapture them. He also sent word through trusted channels to loyal guards and servants who might be able to assist them. As dawn began to break over the palace, Marcus realized that they had survived the most dangerous phase of the night's crisis. But their ordeal was far from over. King Edmund needed medical attention. The palace still contained hostile forces, and the broader political implications of Blackwood's attempted coup would need to be addressed. But for the moment, the royal family was reunited and safe, and Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came with fulfilling his oath to protect them regardless of the personal cost. The knight had tested every aspect of his training, experience, and dedication, and he had not been found wanting when his king and prince needed him most. The early morning light streaming through the windows of the royal chambers revealed the full extent of the night's chaos and the challenges that still lay ahead. King Edmund's condition had stabilized somewhat, thanks to the emergency care provided by a loyal physician who had managed to reach them through the palace's hidden passages. The king's wound, while serious, had missed vital organs, and with proper rest and medical attention, he was expected to recover fully. Prince Louis had not left his father's side throughout the night, holding vigil with a dedication that reminded Marcus of the young man's deep love for his family. The prince's clothes were still torn and stained from his earlier captivity, and exhaustion was evident in his eyes, but his determination to protect his father remained unwavering. Marcus had spent the pre-dawn hours coordinating with loyal palace guards who had gradually revealed themselves as Blackwood's conspiracy collapsed. Many of the regular security force had been deliberately reassigned or removed from their posts as part of the coup attempt, but they had begun returning to the palace as word spread that the royal family had regained control. The captain was in the process of organizing search teams to locate and arrest the remaining conspirators when a commotion in the corridor outside caught his attention. Voices were approaching, some familiar and some not, and Marcus immediately moved to a defensive position while signaling for increased vigilance from the guards protecting the royal chambers. "Captain Marcus," called a voice he recognized as belonging to Sir William Ashford, one of the king's most trusted knights. "We have urgent news from the eastern provinces." Marcus cautiously opened the door to find Sir William accompanied by a travel-worn messenger and several guards who had clearly ridden hard through the night. Behind them, to Marcus's immense relief, was Prince Alexander, the king's elder son and heir to the throne. Prince Alexander looked haggard from hard travel, and his eyes showed the strain of someone who had received terrible news and rushed to respond to a crisis. When he saw Marcus, relief flooded his features, followed immediately by concern as he took in the defensive posture of the guards and the obvious signs of recent conflict. "Captain," Alexander said urgently, "we received word of trouble at the palace. Is my family safe? Where's my father?" "Your father is wounded, but alive, Your Highness," Marcus replied, stepping aside to allow Alexander entry to the royal chambers. "Prince Louis is unharmed. Lord Blackwood attempted a coup during the night, but we were able to prevent it." Alexander rushed to his father's bedside, where King Edmund was resting under the physician's care. The reunion between father and son was deeply emotional, with both men clearly relieved to see each other alive and safe after the night's traumatic events. "Father," Alexander said softly, taking the king's hand, "I came as soon as I received Sir William's message. I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me." "You're here now," King Edmund replied weakly, but with obvious joy at seeing his elder son. "That's what matters. How did you know to come?" Sir William stepped forward to explain. "Your Majesty, we received intelligence 3 days ago suggesting that Lord Blackwood was planning something against the crown. Prince Alexander decided to return immediately, but we also sent advance scouts to gather more information." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and frustration at this revelation. If they had known about the potential threat earlier, many of the knight's dangers might have been avoided. But he was also grateful the help had arrived when it was most needed. "What intelligence?" Marcus asked. "How much did you know about Blackwood's plans?" "Not enough, unfortunately," Alexander admitted. "We knew he was corresponding secretly with representatives from neighboring kingdoms, and we suspected he was building a network of supporters within our own court. But we didn't realize how far advanced his plans were, or that he would move so quickly." Prince Louis, who had been quietly listening to this conversation, suddenly spoke up with information that surprised everyone. "He's been planning this for months," Louis said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "I overheard conversations that I didn't understand at the time, but now I realize he was coordinating with people outside the kingdom. What conversations? King Edmund asked, his voice growing stronger as his interest was engaged. Lewis described several instances over the past few months when he had accidentally encountered Lord Blackwood in private discussions with visitors to the palace. At the time, he had assumed these were normal diplomatic or administrative meetings, but reflecting on them now, he could see patterns that suggested a coordinated conspiracy. He mentioned someone called the Northern Alliance, Lewis recalled. I heard him say that once the succession was settled according to their agreement, Eldoria would have a place in the new regional order. This information sent a chill through everyone present. The Northern Alliance was a coalition of kingdoms that had been forming over the past year, ostensibly for trade purposes, but with clear military and political implications. If Blackwood had been working with them to destabilize Eldoria from within, his coup attempt was just one part of a much larger threat to the kingdom's independence. Marcus realized that their successful defense of the royal family was just the beginning of a longer struggle. Your Majesty, he said to King Edmund, we need to assess the full extent of the conspiracy and determine which other officials might have been compromised. King Edmund nodded weakly, but with determination. Alexander, I'm placing you in charge of the investigation and the response. Work with Captain Marcus and Sir William to identify everyone involved and take whatever measures are necessary to protect the kingdom. Prince Alexander accepted this responsibility with the gravity it deserved. Father, should we send word to our allies? If the Northern Alliance is involved, we may need external support. Yes, the king agreed. But first, we need to secure our own house and ensure that we can trust our own people. Over the next several hours, as King Edmund rested and recovered, a clearer picture of the conspiracy emerged. Blackwood had indeed been working with the Northern Alliance to weaken Eldoria from within, with the ultimate goal of forcing the kingdom into their coalition as a subordinate member rather than an independent ally. The coup attempt had been timed to coincide with Prince Alexander's absence, and a period when the kingdom's regular military forces were dispersed on routine exercises. If it had succeeded, Blackwood would have become regent, with authority to sign treaties and make agreements that would have effectively ended Eldoria's sovereignty. Several other court officials were identified as collaborators, including some who had been trusted advisors for years. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and Marcus found himself questioning his own judgment about people he had thought he knew well. During this investigation, Prince Louis displayed a maturity and insight that impressed everyone involved. His observations about conversations he had overheard proved crucial in understanding the scope of the conspiracy, and his suggestions for security improvements showed a tactical awareness that surprised even Marcus. Your Highness, Marcus said to Louis during a quiet moment when they were alone, your actions last night showed tremendous courage. Your father and the kingdom are in your debt. I just did what I had to do, Louis replied modestly. But, Captain, what you did, rescuing me, protecting my father, stopping Blackwood, that was true heroism. I'll never forget what you've done for our family. Marcus felt deeply moved by the young prince's gratitude, but he also recognized that their relationship had changed fundamentally during the night's events. Louis was no longer the sheltered young man he had been just hours before. The crisis had forced him to confront harsh realities about politics, betrayal, and violence that had accelerated his transition into adulthood. Your Highness, Marcus said carefully, last night changed all of us. You've seen things that no young man should have to see, and you've had to make decisions that will stay with you forever. If you ever need to talk about what happened, I'm here. Thank you, Louis said with genuine emotion. I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't found me when you did. And seeing my father wounded because of someone we trusted, his voice trailed off as the full emotional impact of the experience began to catch up with him. Marcus recognized the signs of delayed shock and trauma that often followed intense crisis situations. It's normal to have these feelings, he assured Louis. What you experience will be difficult for anyone to process. The important thing is that you and your family are safe now. As the day progressed, news of the failed coup spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. Loyal forces moved quickly to arrest the remaining conspirators and secure key locations that might have been targeted for seizure. Messages were sent to allied kingdoms warning them about the Northern Alliance's aggressive intentions and requesting support if needed. Lord Blackwood himself had been taken into custody and was being held in the palace dungeon, pending formal charges of treason. His interrogation was revealing additional details about the broader conspiracy and helping authorities identify other potential threats throughout the kingdom. King Edmund's recovery progressed steadily, and by evening he was able to sit up and participate more actively in discussions about the kingdom's response to the crisis. His first priority was ensuring the safety and security of his family and his people, but he was also concerned about the long-term implications of the Northern Alliance's actions. This won't end with Blackwood's arrest, the king observed during a family conference that included both princes, Marcus, and other key advisors. They'll try again, possibly with different tactics and different allies within our kingdom. Then, we need to be better prepared, Prince Alexander said firmly. We need better intelligence gathering, more thorough background investigations of court officials, and improved security protocols throughout the palace and the kingdom. Prince Louis, who had been quietly listening to this discussion, made a suggestion that surprised everyone. Father, what if we use this crisis as an opportunity to strengthen our relationships with our people? The Northern Alliance succeeded partly because they found people willing to betray their own kingdom. Maybe we need to give our citizens more reasons to remain loyal. This insight showed a political wisdom beyond Louis's years, and Marcus could see both King Edmund and Prince Alexander considering the implications of the suggestion. The young prince was demonstrating that his ordeal had not broken his spirit, but had instead given him a deeper understanding of leadership and responsibility. As night fell over the palace once again, Marcus found himself reflecting on the dramatic events of the past 24 hours. The crisis had tested everyone involved, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that would need to be addressed moving forward. But, most importantly, it had demonstrated the unbreakable bonds of loyalty and love that held the royal family together. Standing at his post outside the royal chambers, watching over the family he had sworn to protect, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction and renewed purpose. The palace was secure, the kingdom was safe, and the royal family was stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together with the same courage and determination that had carried them through their darkest hour. Prince Louis appeared in the doorway, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He joined Marcus at his post, and they stood together in comfortable silence. Both men changed forever by their shared experience, but united in their commitment to protecting what they held most dear. "Captain," Louis said quietly, "thank you for everything. Not just last night, but for all the years you've watched over me and my family. I understand now what that means." Marcus smiled, feeling the pride of a man who had fulfilled his life's greatest purpose. "It has been my honor, Your Highness, and it always will be." As the palace settled into peaceful sleep, protected by loyal guards and surrounded by the love of family, the kingdom of Eldoria began a new chapter in its long history, stronger and more united than ever before.